There is no such thing as an impartial or neutral media, and never has. The idea that such thing exists is ludicrous per se and ignorant of human nature and of the inherent system of incentives that exist in any society, organization, or community. Now sure, a media venue can be neutral or impartial about certain topics. For instance, I can be as neutral as you can get in a discussion about how cute and fluffy bunnies are, since I neither love nor hate bunnies, and if it's outside the context of food, I have no opinion whatsoever about bunnies, and thus I can discuss very dispassionately the topic of cuteness and fluffiness of bunnies. Now with that said, the idea of an overall impartial or neutral media is nothing less than a feel-good mythology. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of the series Feel Good Mythology. Now, the idea of the impartial media was born out of the ignorance of the transitional period between newspapers only and the media as we know it today. Now, for a while, at least in the Western Bloc, the media was freer and more entertaining than it had been prior to, let's say, the 1950s, but it was also a lot less open than it is now thanks to the internet. Now that's the period when the myth of the impartial journalist was born, a mythology that indeed endured for decades and has only recently started being slowly dismantled. Now, when it comes to leftists, I really do understand why they insist upon perpetuating this myth. I mean, it is, after all, in their best interest, since leftists dominated the cathedral media, outnumbering normal people 5-1 in most countries, though in Britain or in Sweden, they probably outnumber normal people 20-1, especially in the British Brainwash Corporation or the SVT. Now, what I don't understand is why are there figures on the right who still try to cling to this mythology. Now, at the beginning of this month, Prager University, one of the most successful right-leaning channels on YouTube, uploaded a video titled, "Can You Trust the Press?" Now, the overall message of the video is that one should want to work towards an environment where the people can trust the press. Now, whether that's a worthy goal or not is certainly up for debate, especially in the context of the alternative media. But the premise of the video itself is faulty. Now let's take a look first and then we'll comment.
Liberal or conservative, male or female, young or old, Americans love to bash the news media. Once among the nation's most trusted institutions, the news media have fallen from grace.
Now, for starters, none of that is false. It is true that the news media was once amongst the most trusted institutions, but that doesn't mean that was a good thing. Now, I don't want to judge Americans too harshly because the circumstances were different. In the 80s, we in Eastern Europe knew full well that most of what the media tells us is most of the time entirely false and sometimes merely misleading. That instinct stuck with us even today, so even today the lowest degree of trust in the news media in Europe is in Eastern Europe, though according to a recent study by the European Broadcasting Union, Southwestern Europe is coming down to the same level as us, probably because of the news media's failure to accurately report on the migrant crisis. But anyway, I'm digressing. Now, going back to America and the PragerU video, the fact that the news media was once amongst the nation's most trusted institutions was a very bad thing in and of itself. The fact that today the news media is amongst the least trusted institutions is a very, very good thing in and of itself. Now, what happened in the United States applies to Europe as a whole until 1948, and then only to Western Europe until 1990, and then again to Europe as a whole from 1990 onwards. Basically, media bias has always been with us, but in the past, before 1960 something in the US and before 1950 in Europe, partisanship and bias was clear and open right from the get-go. Media outlets used to be open about their political affiliation and generally honest about the fact that they present a particular point of view or that they report through a particular perspective. However, after the middle of the 20th century, especially after 1970 in the United States, though slightly earlier in Europe, two distinct events happened, one in the United States and one in Europe. The events are: one, journalism became a profession for which you would get a college degree, that was in the United States, and two, the advent of state-owned media, that would be Europe. Now, although these two events are distinct, their result was identical: the birth of the mythological belief that journalists are somehow above bias and absolutely impartial and neutral. Now, in addition to these events, the rise of the television led to a decrease in the number of newspapers, and since broadcasting on TV was expensive, the media market became controlled by a few networks between mid-1950s and way into mid-1980s. In the US, there were basically 3 networks, in Britain just 1, in Sweden just 1 until 1992, and so was most of Europe, East and West. Now, 1 network per country, and more often than not, that network was owned and operated by the state. So it is no wonder that the myth of the allegedly impartial journalist was created and survived for so long. Now, combine the growing inherent leftism of universities over the last 50 years with the fact that the market was controlled by only a few entities, and now you also know why most of the cathedral media is leftist. Now, okay, but this explains why there is no such thing as non-biased media, and why it is in the best interest of the left to cling to this myth anyway, but it still doesn't answer the question on why there are some on the right who cling to this mythology. Now let's watch a bit more from the PragerU video, maybe we can get an answer.
In the 1950s, the media universe consisted mainly of a few national television broadcast networks and local TV and radio stations, most of which got much of their news from major wire services in the nation's large newspapers. Most journalists were committed to producing objective journalism, fact-based stories independent of the government and of political parties. A reporter's job was to report, not offer opinion or advocate. Presented with the facts, it was up to readers to make their own judgments about news events. Opinions were supposed to be confined to editorial and op-ed pages. That world no longer exists.
Okay, we're not getting anywhere. First of all, that world about which this former New York Times reporter talks about never existed. Now sure, maybe a few individuals from the profession actually believed in that, but overall that world is a fiction. A feel-good mythology with which older media hacks can intellectually masturbate and feel superior to younger media hacks. She does make a good point, though, later in the video, that the bias wouldn't be so bad if the journalists at least acknowledged their biases up front, which they rarely do if they are leftist. Now let's go straight to the end of the PragerU's video, maybe we do get some answer.
A decline in reporting standards, a decline in revenue, an increase in bias have made many wary of the people who provide them with their news. A certain amount of skepticism is a healthy thing, but a thriving democracy depends on a dynamic and free press. As much as people may like to bash the media, most people would far prefer to trust it. I'm Judith Miller, contributing editor of City Journal for Prager University.
This is probably the second worst video published by Prager after the one advocating marriage for men whilst leaving out women's responsibility from the mess created in divorce courts. This one is less bad than that one, but still a disaster. First of all, the United States does not have to be a democracy, let alone a thriving democracy. Quite the opposite. The framers envisioned the system to be as undemocratic as possible because they thought, and rightfully so I might add, that democracy is dangerous and fundamentally flawed. Now, I don't know about you, but I would expect these things to be known and self-evident on PragerU. Secondly, thanks to the internet, now we can all have a very dynamic and free press. Also, she complains whilst she works for City Journal, a publication belonging to the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, which is a conservative think tank from New York. Now that's fine, mind you. We know where her biases lie, and there is nothing wrong with that. What we don't know is where is this insistence on the right coming from that such thing as a non-partisan media not only can exist, but indeed has existed or can exist now. Again, it is understandable for leftists to at least pretend to believe in this mythology, since universities pull out thousands upon thousands of journalism graduates who are to the left of Mao Zedong. So it makes practical political sense for leftists to claim they believe university-educated journalists are indeed impartial and non-partisan. They can easily sell radical far-left ideas through this scheme. But what sense does it make to push this mythology on the right? I guess I'll have to think about this a little bit more. But in any event, the situation of the media market today resembles the one in the 19th century. In the 19th century and early in the 20th century, there were a plethora of newspapers, each with its own bias. But the bias was, for the most time, acknowledged, and the reader had quite a vast palette of choice at his disposal. In present day, on the internet, it's 19th century all over again, but with a lot more choice at one's disposal and very cheap opportunities to start one's own media venue. And just like in the 19th century, the quality of reporting does indeed vary dramatically, and it is up to the reader to discern and make up his own mind. And there's nothing wrong with that. Except now it's a lot easier for the reader, or for the listeners, or for the viewer to fact-check things. And just like in the 19th century, vote with his wallet and his eyeballs for or against a media venue. And just like in the 19th century, the biases are mostly acknowledged both on the left and on the right. And that's a far superior trade-off than the pretense that what we see on Rai Uno or on CNN or on BBC or on SVT is somehow the gold standard of objective and impartial journalism and not intense shilling for the far left. Now, I would rather read Salon or Huffington Post than watch CNN or read the New York Times. At least the former have the balls to be upfront about their far-left bias. Now, I would like to give an example from the right too, but it doesn't come to my mind any example of obvious right-wing media that goes to great lengths to hide that fact. Now, if you know any example, please let me know in the comments. So, bottom line, there is no such thing as a neutral media. I am not neutral. In fact, I went to great lengths to show why moderation is not always good and why the pretense of neutrality is oftentimes more damning than taking a position. Now, when I'm wrong, I change my position. It is better that way than to pretend to be on the fence. Neutrality is the lazy position. That's why I started this channel with a video explaining my own political position and the direction of the channel, so nobody can complain that they're getting something else. Wouldn't it be nice if CNN would start its reporting with, let's say, "Good evening everyone, this is John Smith from the Communist News Network and welcome to the far left perspective on the news." Now that would be, at the very least, honest. and probably would, in time, reverse the trend of distrust in the media. Because let's make no mistake, people don't increasingly trust the alternative media because they believe the alternative media is objective. They trust the alternative media because they believe it is honest, including and especially when it acts in a partisan manner. Anyway, we'll have to come back to this topic at some point in future, but until then, thank you all for watching, thank you for your continuous support of this channel, and I guess I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.